presentation. And I think as we're 3 past the hour, we can get started and really want to welcome each and every one of you, not only our panelists, but also our attendees that have joined this Zoom inaugural panel discussion for the Center for Multi-Religious Studies. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Sam Porferzani. I'm director of the Center for Multi-Religious Studies and assistant professor of Islamic and Digital Media Studies at Starr King School for the Ministry. Today, we promise to have a wonderful, excellent program titled Multi-Religiosity in the United States, Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim Perspectives. Our speakers include Dr. Scott Mitchell, Dr. Pravina Rodriguez, and Professor Najiba Saeed. I will offer a bit more of a formal introduction to each of our speakers later in the program. And we'll have a question and answer session to follow the discussion. So if you see the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you can submit questions at any time using that feature of Zoom. If you want to use the chat, you're obviously welcome to do so to chat, but we'd love for you to just collate all of your questions into the Q&A feature so that we can respond to them accordingly. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce the president of our school, the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt, who will say a few words about our center.
Thank you, Sam. I am so happy to see all of you here and to welcome our honored guests to this inaugural lecture. For a long, long time, Starr King has been a place where not just Unitarian Universalist religious leaders in training could be educated and learn to lead, but also students from a variety of traditions. That has been one of our strengths and one of the things we're most proud of. But in these mid-pandemic days, it seemed even more urgent to create a kind of container for the work that we already do and to use it as a launching pad for work that we want to do more of. Dr. Porferzani has brought together a host of people and ideas, combined them with his own many skills, not just in religious life, but also in the digital space. That is a appealing combination in this 21st century world that we find ourselves. And so the Center for Multi-Religious Studies was meant to lift up these possibilities and open the doors for rich dialogue and deep learning. And I'm grateful to Sam for taking on this challenge and grateful to all of you for being a part of this very first event. Sam, back to you. I'm going to disappear into the audience now.
Sounds good. And thank you, Rosemary. Thank you for your kind words and your leadership. We really appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure.
I think perhaps just before we begin, there may be some questions on our audience's mind of what is a Center for Multi-Religious Studies. So I'll say a few words about the ethos behind the development of the center and what it is we aim to do and the programs that we offer. Firstly, many of us, myself included, have grown into settings where religious identity and formation are of a binary nature, where Christian or Muslim, Buddhist or Hindu, Jewish or Baha'i, spiritual but not religious. The first of its kind, the Center for Multi-Religious Studies represents a radical approach to the study of the world's diverse religious traditions within their own contexts, nurturing the study of non-binary multi-religious identity. The center is a premier hub for the academic and vocational exploration of multi-religious identity and practice, where all faiths and spiritualities are welcome as equal partners in educating to counter oppressions and creating just and sustainable communities. The center was founded in 2021 and honors the legacy of Starr King's beloved former provost, Dr. Ibrahim Farajajeh, and his work in organic multi-religiosity. Bringing together progressive religious leaders, scholars, and social activists, the center offers graduate-level courses, research, symposia, and public programs that advance scholarship and dialogue about multi-religious spiritual formation, ritual arts, education, and their interrelated dimensions. The center also offers a certificate in multi-religious studies, as well as multi-religious chaplaincy training in coordination with Starr King's chaplaincy concentration. There's a lot more to say about the center and what we do, but you can just visit sksm.edu/cmrs to learn more and to receive updates about our upcoming events and public programs. And I would be remiss in not saying something about a word of appreciation to Dr. Gabriella Latini, our Dean of Faculty, and of course, Reverend Rosemary Brave McNatt, our president, who we heard from, for their vision in the development of the center. Dr. Ellen Plummer, our community development coordinator, for her work working with the center and also in developing this program. Xander Huffman, our Director of Communications, and also Allison Duran-Sutherland, who have helped put together the tech for this program and are making sure the lights are still on throughout the event. So that, as Scott mentioned before, our call is probably the most important role of this whole thing to make sure that we're all able to keep talking. And I see Professor Najiba Saeed has joined us in perfect timing as I'm just about to introduce our speakers. Welcome, Najiba. So you can check our website for the full bios, as I don't want to take too much of our time for you just listening to me speak. Obviously, we have these esteemed speakers who will be way more interesting than what I have to say at this time. Speaking of Dr. Scott, Scott is the Reverend Yoshitaka Tamai Professor of Jodo Shinshu Buddhist Studies and Dean of Students and Faculty Affairs at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, as well as core doctoral faculty at the Graduate Theological Union. His research interests include Buddhism in Western contexts, Buddhist modernity, Pure Land Buddhism, translocal regions, ritual studies, and media studies. Scott's publications include Buddhism in America, Global Religion, Local Contexts, and numerous articles and journal publications. Scott is a graduate of San Francisco State University and earned a master's and a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. We're also joined by Dr. Pravina Rodriguez, who holds a PhD in Theology and Ethics from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. She is an adjunct faculty here at Starr King, as well as the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University. She is an assistant editor for the Journal of Dharma Studies and associate editor of a 34-chapter volume at the intersection of ecology and religion titled Religion and Sustainability, Interreligious Resources, Interdisciplinary Responses, which is forthcoming from Springer. Pravina received a master's in comparative theology from the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University, as well as a bachelor's degree in sociology from SNDT Women's University in Mumbai, and a bachelor's degree of theology from St. Pius College in Mumbai. Her research interests include post-coloniality in Hindu-Christian comparative theology, methodology in comparative and interfaith theology, comparative mysticism, and also faith and pluralism. Welcome, Scott and Pravina, and as well as Najiba, who has been a professor, expert practitioner, and public speaker in the fields of conflict resolution, interfaith studies, mediation, education, deliberative democracy, social, gender, and racial equity. She has served in numerous roles, including Chief of Staff to Council Member Nithya Raman, the first Asian American woman elected to the Los Angeles City Council. Najiba's peace and justice work has been the subject of news reports and documentaries, and the NBC documentary, Waging Peace, Muslim and Christian Alternatives. Najiba's scholarship includes faith-based, community-based conflict resolution, restorative and healing justice, interfaith just peacemaking, and social justice hermeneutics for interfaith learning. She's the co-editor of Critical Approaches to Interreligious Education, supported by the Henry Luce Foundation. Najiba is a graduate of Guilford College and Indiana University Maurer School of Law, and was awarded the Doctor of Human Letters from Starr King School for the Ministry, and is one of our visiting professors here at Starr King. So again, welcome Najiba, welcome Pravina, welcome Scott. I'm so grateful to have you here to speak about multi-religiosity with us. And I'd like to ask for our first question to consider as a group that multi-religiosity has been described through the use of similar terms, such as multiple religious belonging, spiritual fluidity, religious hybridity, and others. How does the concept of multi-religiosity play out in your own current work? Please feel free to unmute when you feel so moved.
So I would say in my work, thank you for reading my very diverse bio. In my own work, I refer to particularly my work on Muslim women as embodied religious pluralism, particularly for visibly Muslim women. They often are what I also consider in secular and public spaces, whether it's here in the United States or in other parts of the world, where a visibly Muslim woman is often what I call an embodied interruption. Even before they open their mouths, we see across the world the challenges, the legal challenges that have been created, particularly against the dress that some Muslim women choose to adopt. Whether it's in France or other parts of the world, it's extending as a kind of a form of control of Muslim women in a very gendered Islamophobic way. So I think one of the things that I found in my work, I was asked a number of years ago, what forms of hybridity exist? And in my work, the reconciliation of being able to deal with a body that has Islam attached to it, both by the agency of the individual and then by the state, having to navigate those secular spaces, walking into these spaces as this interruption before even one speaks, creates a skill set for many Muslim women so that their embodied religious pluralism is found in the body of the text. I often have been the first Muslim professor in Christian seminaries where I teach. And before students read the Quran, they read my body and my text as a visibly Muslim woman. So that experience of consistently having to work in an environment that is multi-religious, and I want to add to part of multi-religiosity is this notion of secularities and secularism, and that we navigate not just other religions, but we navigate these secular spaces, sometimes depending on the country and and where it is. Secularities have very particular emanations. So for me, that's part of how I approach it, is looking at the body as a text, looking at the engagement of these particular bodies with the state, and whether we live in a moment or a time, as we know in the United States, at every election cycle, the presidential election cycle, Islamophobia spikes, and we can trace this for the last 20 years. And it is both a difficulty in terms of people who are targeted, particularly Muslim women are targeted for hate crimes, but it's also an incredible skill set that I have learned to identify with women that I've interviewed who carry this capacity, an internal reconciliation of their body within these spaces, and are able to speak skillfully about that process of embodied religious pluralism.
Thank you so much, Najiba. Fascinating. Any thoughts from you, Pravina or Scott?
Sure, I can go. So first, I just want to say congratulations on establishing the Center for Multi-Religious Studies, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thank you to President Rosemary, Dean Latini, and everyone who's been instrumental. I've been part of this discussion, so I feel honored to be here. So in my work that you so kindly introduced in the beginning, I'm not sure if you did, but my forthcoming publication, which basically proposes a Shakta model for comparative theology. In that, I give an account of my journey from Catholicism into a Hindu tradition, specifically a Shakta tradition. And my context, as you mentioned at the beginning, is a multi-religious multicultural, multilinguistic context because I'm from Mumbai, India. And I use that context to talk about multi-religiosity. But when I'm talking about my journey specifically, I don't use the terms hybrid or multi-religious. And the reason why I don't use the term hybrid is because I feel that it's restraining and it puts me in a box. I feel that I'm more than just hybrid. I'm tribrid, I'm quadbrid, I'm multi-brid. And when I say that, I don't mean that I'm practicing more than 2 religions or 3 religions at one time. I just feel that there are various elements to my religious identity, and that identity itself is complex. So that's one of the reasons why I didn't use the term hybrid in talking about my religious journey. I also didn't use the term convert because it has negative connotations. Conversion is always looked at from a Christian perspective. When someone moves from one tradition to another, and if there's some kind of religious boundary crossing, they are considered a heretic or an apostate. Not among all Christians, but there are certain groups and communities. So I didn't use that term either. So the way I look at it is from the perspective of experience. No experience can be denied or rejected. So for example, if I've had a particular experience, I can say that it was good or it was bad, or I can sort of categorize that experience. Now, if I have a certain feeling about that experience, there is a way for me to distance myself from that experience, or probably even to look at it, in a different light. But I feel that when I look at it from the point of experience, everything that I have experienced becomes part of me. So it gets assimilated within me, within my subtle body, within my consciousness. It sort of enhances my cognitive skills. It teaches me how to relate to other. It sort of broadens my perspective. So when I look at it from the point of experience, I feel that I really haven't really left my Catholic identity behind, because I can't reject it. I can't press the delete button and say, that's it, I'm done with this. So for example, I can say that I'm living in Berkeley now, but that doesn't mean that I'm rejecting the fact that I was raised in Mumbai, the fact that I've lived in a particular community, so on and so forth. So I kind of struggled with how to label my experience, and then I ended up actually not labeling it at all. So that's basically how I presented a trajectory for why this work, my forthcoming publication, that is the presentation of a Shakta model for comparative theology. But I don't really label that or that experience. I just show the trajectory and the flow of it, and also that basically helps people see why the project is important to me. So yeah.
It's really interesting that you bring up experience, Pravina, as it makes me think of practice and praxis, but I certainly would love to hear what Scott has to say
Yeah,
first.
that's why the one of the things that I mentioned in the title of my publication is a Shakta Nemo praxis, because what happens is that sometimes we think that we can learn of the other from a book, from a textbook, and the current model that exists right now is very hypertextual. So it's looking at things from it sort of juxtaposes symbols and persons, so on and so forth. And in presenting a Shakta model, I'm basically presenting a model that is rooted in a community, in practice, in experience. And I think that you can't really put experience into a box and label it. It's just so complex.
Thank you all. Thank you, Song, for the invitation to be here today. It's really quite a pleasure, and I am I am already humbled and in awe of my colleagues on this panel who are speaking far more eloquently than I possibly could. I was struck by this question when you gave us this prompt, and I wasn't quite sure how to answer it, but just hearing other people's responses, it sparks a lot of interest, a lot of thoughts that I think that I can share. My current research is actually a historical project that looks at the history of Japanese American Jodo Shinshu Buddhists in the United States, particularly in the 1930s to the 1950s, which is a challenging time for the community, to put it mildly. And I'm inspired by what Najiba had to say about her work and Muslim women being read even before they open their mouths in public spaces, reminds me of this longer history of a different kind of multi-religiosity, which is one of conflict, that goes back to when first, second generation Japanese American Buddhists were racialized, certainly, but they were also targeted as a religious minority. And so those intersections, particularly in the public sphere or in a secular space of both multiple levels of identity that get problematized by the state, is a pretty big part of what my work focuses on now, which as a historian, it's always, I feel it's important to see our work in these longer trajectories, to move away from sort of narratives of rupture, of things are bad now, and the corresponding narrative that perhaps they were better in the past, or maybe they're better now and they were worse in the past, rather to sort of contextualize the work that we do within this longer sweep of history, and to learn from that, and then to also recognize that what we're doing now is creating future history. The work that we're doing now is creating the world that our descendants will inherit. And something that Pravina said about, and this discussion about hybridity, I think is rather important. There's in another line of my research, I've been very interested in religious music, and particularly Buddhist music, and in reading ethnomusicologists who are interested in the way in which musical practices change. There's a particular scholar whose name, of course, is escaping me, who speaks about hybridity and problematizes it, because hybridity tends to be an approach in ethnomusicology where you're looking at two cultures that come together and create something new. And so what you're really studying isn't the thing that's new, but the things that it came from. So it's she speaks of it in terms of, we're studying the parents and we're ignoring the child, which I think is a lovely metaphor, which is, as a parent, not an important thing, of course, but I think it's also relevant to sort of think about how these metaphors that we use obscure as well as reveal certain things. And I really appreciate what Pravina had to say about experience and practice, and how we can't just delete our histories. They're a part of who we are in the present moment.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Pravina and Najiba, for your comments as well. I am definitely moved to think through praxis and from what everyone has said, the embodiment of traditions. What do people actually do in their daily lives? How do they live their lives? How do they engage in religious or spiritual practice? And I often, as Scott will know, I often hide behind Talal Asad in his Anthropology of Islam, the idea of an anthropology of Islam, where he signifies that there, historically, the way that Islam as a tradition has been studied is either as a monolith, that Islam is this one thing that you can put in a box, or it's a religion based on informants, meaning that whosoever says they're Muslim, we have to take at their word that what they do is Islamic. And these two, this is actually a false dichotomy. And he says that we don't have to go either with the monolith or with just Islam is whatever anyone says it is. We look at Islam as a discursive tradition with its foundational principles in the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And so we look at discourse, or really we look at practice. How does the thing that a Muslim person do, or a multi-religious person do, how does it connect to, we can say, the roots of their tradition or the foundations of their tradition, even if it's not textual, if it's an oral tradition, or if there are other ways of knowing in that tradition or in those traditions? What is the actual embodiment of the practice? What does that tell us about the richness of their experience, as you so well put, Pravina? I think that actually ties into a question way further down my list, but I think it's important to bring up at this time, that from an anthropological perspective, concepts like multi-religiosity can be thought of as artificial, given that the individual and group belief, given that individual and group beliefs and practices tend to range on a diverse spectrum, rather than being static or monolithic. So how would you account for, illustrate this diversity in your tradition or traditions of expertise? We may not necessarily think of ourselves as multi-religious, or even our traditions as multi-religious, and oftentimes there are so many different cultural practices, regional beliefs, ways that things are interpreted and interpolated, from in traditions that have more like top-down. I'm thinking, for example, Catholic traditions, they may have a single figurehead in the Pope, or in the office of the Pope, but we can look to Catholics to offer what is diversity within Catholic traditions, that actually sometimes there's arguments, sometimes there's discussions, and definitely there's different lived practices based on the region or the specific tradition. So what would you have to say about the diversity within the traditions that you either represent or that you have studied?
Sam, maybe you could just identify a speaker. So would that work?
Sure. I see that you've unmuted, Najiba. So would you like to go first?
Be careful what you wish for. So I think one thing that for me in my work is that the way that I study embodied religious pluralism is really descriptive. So I'm not in sort of, the way I'm talking about it is not to advocate for a particular emanation. I think this is one of those areas of study where looking at what's already happening is very important, and the engaged research for me guides the theory. And I think one of the problems that we've had with this field, coming from a comparative theological lens with a largely, as Frank Clooney and others talk about, largely Christian white sort of male perspective, I mean, that genealogy of that particular form of comparative work, which is now certainly expansive beyond that. And others were doing comparative theology, but were not named as doing as such. I just wanted to point that out. I think that also is one of the difficulties with the lexicon that has developed in this area. It's also very English in terms of its terminology. So I know I work in multiple languages and with communities that speak multiple languages. So the word hybridity also has a very particular historical context and construct. And I really appreciated Pravina's reflection on that. So even the word syncretism, all of these words have peculiar meanings that don't often resonate actually for me. And I will kind of, one of the pieces that looking at Gloria Anzaldua's work around the spatialization of religious hybridity around borderlands has been very helpful for me in my work. And studying my second book project is about embodied religious pluralism in the Los Angeles interfaith community, particularly during the Trump years, and the activism that was done on border issues. So part of hybridity is also created by the ways that states are organized. So we have across the border here, we're not that far from the border with the southern border with Mexico. And that notion of borderlands is really powerful as a physical location for hybridity that includes also multiple states. We have people that go between states, and that impacts religious practice, that impacts articulation of religious heritage. For others, the spatialization of religious hybridity, I come and was born from in Kashmir. And so in Kashmir, we're at the crossroads between Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and other traditions. There's actually not as much engagement with Christian traditions. So when I do interreligious dialogue and the historical context is a Christian context, and I'm coming from a place of a geographic space where Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims have practiced an organic form of engagement, particularly around shrines, around religious practice, around holidays, around the calendar that is shared, around poets that articulated, you know, sometimes when you're reading poetry in Kashmir, it's a Muslim poet quoting an ancient Hindu sage. And it's not even always clear. So the popularization of hybridity is a lived hybridity. So I'm pointing this all out because I think the spatialization piece is really important to keep in mind, that many of us live at physical borderlands that are created by states, and others of us come from communities where the borderlands are just the crossroads of multiple religious traditions, so that practice and understanding of hybridity doesn't come from a deficit-based understanding, but in fact comes from this capacity to be able to negotiate a deeply grounded tradition with the ability to recognize or understand how these borderlands are created both physically physically in space and on terrain of the land, and also within ourselves and in our bodies, again, an embodied tradition.
That spatialization piece, Najiba, is so fascinating. And it automatically leads me to think of time. Like, how does that change through time? Really, really interesting. Uh, any further thoughts on that, Scott or Pravina, or thoughts of your own?
Um, sure. A part of your question, Sam, had to do with sort of naming these concepts of multi-religiosity or hybridity and so on as artificial, and my initial response to that is was somewhat glib, in the sense of sort of acknowledging that many of the concepts we use are artificial, right? That oftentimes we inhabit the world, and then on reflection we try to make sense of the world by creating binaries or dichotomies or categories, both I think as individuals, but then also as Najiba was saying, you know, through whole academic disciplines such as multi-religious or interreligious or comparative theology, or whatever the academic field might be. In the work that I'm doing right now, I spend a whole book sort of deconstructing what I call unhelpful binaries, which are just a series of arbitrary categories that scholars in my field have come up with to describe the history of Buddhism in this country as traditional or modern, or ethnic communities versus convert communities, you know, and all these other kinds of categories, which only make sense because we think they do. But when you go out into the world and you and I really love this idea of emplacement, of being attentive to the physical spaces that we inhabit, the specific locales, the locales in which we live. And when you go into community and you meet with actual human beings, those categories quickly stop having any meaning whatsoever, because they don't line up with people's lived experiences. And I think that's one of the big important lessons and challenges, is to be open to be open to that, and then allowing those experiences to inform and change our theory as we move forward through the world.
You know, I'm struggling quite a bit actually with this anthropological perspective, because my initiation is in the Shakta tradition, and in the tradition that I follow, which worships the Divine Mother in the Hindu tradition, everything is real, and of course there are categories that we use. The categories are are never enough, and there's an element of indescribability, which means that ultimately I it's called achintya in Sanskrit, but ultimately I may not be able to describe everything. However, an attempt is made. And the other thing is that when anthropologists say that this is artificial, I struggle because I was talking to Alison, I think it was last week, and she had an interesting question, but without getting into the question, what I mentioned to her at that time is, while talking to her, is that right now in the world we have the various kinds of flowers that we have. We have 369,000 species or different kinds of flowering plants. And we don't say that about flowering plants. We have 8.7, I think it's million or something, species of sentient beings. That includes mammals, fish, all kinds of various beings, right? In the water, in the air, and this is not a full count. But it seems like what's happening is that we are accounting for all that kind of diversity. And in the tradition that I follow, all of this diversity, topographical diversity, cosmic diversity, diversity of sentience, and everything that we see is all the presence of the Divine Mother. And it's her real presence. It's not something that we are imagining. It's her real presence. So diversity is something that is part of her nature, that is part of this divine plan, and in the tradition that I follow, it's like diversity just bursts forth. So difference is really not a problem. Difference has to be celebrated, and there are various forms of diversity. There's permutations and combinations of diversity, and even material forms of diversity, which in the Western tradition is just matter, dead matter. But in the tradition that I belong to, it's actually her presence. It's her, not just the force that's animating the things like birds and bees and whatnot. It's not just this force; it's actually her. So it's very form. For example, the whiteness of milk, or the color of the flower, or its form, its particular shape. All of this is her presence. So and it has to be basically nurtured. It has to be supported. So you're not trying to flatten anything. You really want to encourage diversity because that is her presence.
That's really wonderful, Pravina. Thank you for sharing that. And the topic of diversity leads me to think about this term, religious pluralism, celebration of diversity and religious pluralism. And I want to trouble that a little bit and open the discussion for a related topic. So one of the ways in which my research looks at multi-religiosity is in three frames. One being the personal, meaning that I identify as a, let's say, Buddhist Muslim, and how does that play out in my practice? Or we look at the second frame, institutional. We have an organization that aims to have each religious tradition that it represents as an equal partner in the life and spirit of that tradition, of that institution, whether that's a coalition or a seminary or what have you. And the third frame is multi-religious pedagogy, or pedagogical approach with a multi-religious frame, seeking to study each religious tradition within its own context, rather than those of us that grew up in the United States or North America, perhaps Western Europe or elsewhere, might have had global religious traditions classes or world religions classes that were taught from the perspective of white Western Christianity. And so each religious tradition is looked at as out there and other. So Islam is looked at, for just as an example, as a tradition that occupies somewhere let's say, the Middle East or North Africa is very much Arab, very male, very bearded, whatever categories we might have for. I mean, watch Aladdin, you see like what the idea of this Orientalist fabrication of Islam is, rather than as an American tradition, as an African American tradition, as a tradition that is built on all different conceptions of gender, many different things that we could say about the richness and diversity of the Islamic tradition within its own context, rather than from the vantage point of white Western Christianity. And so part of the idea, or part of the underlying ethos of studying multi-religiosity, at least in my work, is to destabilize this perspective of studying other traditions from a specific vantage point. And I wonder, obviously there are a lot of politics and there's power involved. Topics like authority and authenticity come up in these types of discussions. And I wonder what other types of politics are influenced by or impinge upon public expressions of multi-religiosity in your experience. Najeeba, we've started with you, and I'm looking at you because you're teaching about the politics of spiritual hybridity. So perhaps you can kick us off again.
Okay. I think we've created a ritual in absence in a vacuum. So I think that there are many forms of politics that are involved, and the class that I'm teaching, in addition to the book that I'm working on, really was instigated from a decolonial lens. Particularly Kwak Poi Lan, in one of her speeches, talked about not all hybridities are equal, that some hybridities are functional, not for the agency of, I think there's this pejorative sort of idea of a buffet of religions and people are picking and choosing. And much of the study of religious hybridity has been, for instance, people who are college students who are also doing yoga and lighting candles. I'm being pejorative in the description, not in the practice. I'm articulating sort of the way that much of the language that I've been that we expose ourselves to on hybridity doesn't include the reality of a decolonial process. Linda Tuhuwai Smith talks about the act of recovery. And I wanted to interject here indigenous practices. Here in Los Angeles, I've been working and studying indigenous African traditions, the Ifa and other communities that have integrated into the practice of Latino and Latinx communities in Los Angeles. So I point all of this out because part of the political reality is people may choose hybridity or may choose to take on a particular identity, not just because of, not because that's how they feel that day, but for survival. Or as others have talked about, Helena Sosrov Jamir, I just taught her book in my class, talked about the notion of insurgent citizenship, that at other times one needs to create a form of citizenship to have the right to have rights, as she says. You can't even have rights if they're not attached to the state. And so what do we do when the state limits religious identity? Or, as you pointed out, there is an invisibility in the nation building story of Muslims from the inception of this country, or non-Christians being present in the reality, whether it's indigenous communities and others here in the United States. How do we tell the story of our country in a way that is inclusive? It's not just the ontological sense of the laws as they exist, but it's the storytelling of a country. And I think that storytelling of a country is being challenged all over the world right now, in multiple states where people are excluding, whether we're seeing the reality, and that's tied to citizenship. So in Myanmar right now, Rohingya Muslims are being articulated as not having the right of citizenship and not having a connection to the state, even though they may have been there for a long time. And we can think, so I just, that weaponizing of the connection between citizenship and the state and the right to exist and survival are important because they play out, unfortunately, in many of the genocides internationally, which is part of the work that I do, is looking at that kind of violence, whether it's an immediate genocide or a slow genocide, where the expulsion or ethnic cleansing is another form in which we see religion as playing out in a very problematic way. And sometimes one asserts hybridity, a multiple religious belonging for the sake of survival. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's convenience for some, and for others, it's a reality of trying to survive as a community. And that colonial experience for many communities with my students, and I'll end here, the recovery of some of my Pacific Islander students who are Christian clergy, being able to acknowledge their indigenous roots and elevating the elements of indigenous practice, not just as a cultural component, but as a source of spiritual foundation, has just been a profound experience when I was teaching here in LA at Claremont School of Theology, and I had students coming to me crying, and students who who were Korean, talking about understanding that within their family they had multiple folk traditions and indigenous traditions. So I point this out because it's seen as if religious hybridity is a new phenomenon, but many of my students are retrieving and recovering, as Linda Tuhai Smith would say, this history of indigenous practices that have found their way into their rituals of their own communities, but naming it and feeling it within the body. I've had students crying with me in classes talking about what it meant to be able to name, acknowledge, and engage and elevate sort of this epistemic commitment to their indigenous practices beyond just a cultural or a passing interest, and seeing it as old as their own religious practice, if not often predating the formal religious practice that they are now engaged in.
How fascinating, Najiba. I mean, how does one account for, a minority person or group taking on certain cultural or religious practices of the majority, even if they're performative? And conversely, like one of the things when we look at African American Muslims between let's say the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, we don't really see much in terms of African American Islamists that had been eradicated by white slave owners. But we do see vestiges of traditions, right? We see examples of people, for example, who wash their feet before bed because their grandmother did so, which was actually part of the Islamic ablutions before prayer. And so these are thought of as cultural practices, but they're actually inherited religious practices that eventually lead towards African American Muslims in the early 20th century reverting to Islam rather than converting, because it's already part of their tradition and their ancestry. Just absolutely fascinating. Thank you for bringing this specific topic to light. Scott, if I had your book in front of me, I think I would pull, and I need to be a better colleague by doing so. But in terms of Buddhism in America, I feel like there's a lot of topics here that we could bring to the fore.
I feel once again humbled, and I'm not sure if I could follow up the rich conversation we've already had. I really appreciate, Najiba, what you said about not all hybridities are equal, and it reminded me, or it sparked a thought in my mind of something else that somebody mentioned a little while ago about spiritual but not religious, and the specific ways in which Buddhism in this country, even today, actually right before this event, I came from another event where one of the people in the audience did the thing where they said this is more of a comment than a question, and started talking about how Buddhism is more of a philosophy than a religion, and then went on to say a lot of other things that caused me to just close that Zoom meeting rather than engage. But that sense of Buddhism being of sort of denying the religiosity of Buddhism does a lot of rhetorical and political work that serves particular ideologies and invisibilizes entire communities. By making that claim that Buddhism is a philosophy, it gives power to persons who look like me to come in and say this is an identity, or a worldview, or a system of beliefs, or a philosophy that I can adopt and use for whatever purposes I want to use, while also ignoring the actual religious practices of hundreds of millions of people around the world. One of the things that I've been thinking about, sort of in those loose stray moments of my day recently, has been how the way in which religion, because of its colonialist history, and because of its indebtedness to a sort of Christian a Christian concept that was dreamt up, the idea of belief becomes really important, right? The idea of making sure that if you're a religious person, you hold certain beliefs, you adhere to certain doctrines. And in Buddhism, there's this concept of the three treasures, that a Buddhist takes refuge in: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha, of course, is the Buddha, and the Dharma is the teachings, and then the Sangha is the community. And I often have been reflecting recently on how quickly, in certain American Buddhist circles, those first two things are very, very important. Particularly the second one, where Dharma becomes really important. How do we interpret the Dharma? How do we teach the Dharma? And everybody sort of forgets about that third one, the Sangha, which is the community, which is the actual group of people that you associate with as Buddhists. And I want to sort of get our attention back to that third category, because if you just say Buddhism is a philosophy, you miss this incredible richness of a full religious tradition, which includes community and ritual and art and literature and poetry and all of the stuff that's just so beautiful, that philosophy can't quite capture. So I'm not sure if that helps this conversation at all, but this is what I give.
Well, it helps me understand the topic better. So I hope that's shared among all of our attendees. Thank you, Scott. Pravina, do you have anything to add to this particular part of the discussion?
Sure. Actually, I think that there seems to be a sort of a distance, or even some kind of intellectual pride or hubris among scholars, because they think they're coining these words. But actually, the problem is that these realities, these lived realities, have always existed. People have, and there's another term, a religious boundary crossing. I mean, if you look at it from whose perspective are you looking at it from? If you're looking at it from a Hindu perspective, really there are no boundaries. You are free to practice. You are free to participate in more than 1, 2, 3 religions. You can assimilate, and in fact, for Hindus, you are known by the specific deity that you are worshipped, and they will ask you, what is your practice? Upasana, which means that what is your specific practice that you follow? Because it can be anthropomorphic, it can be iconic, it can be absolutely without any symbols, it can be just purely apophatic. So it seems like a lot of the language that is being used is pretending to come up with new theory without acknowledging that this I mean, from a South Asian perspective, it has always been there. In fact, you could be at some point in now, of course, it's different, and each community, Jain, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, all of them, using post-colonial theory and everything that has happened, are now asserting their own identity. And sure, everyone should be able to do that. But there was a time in history, in South Asian history, where you could be practicing more than one religion. In fact, one of the poets who wrote a beautiful poetry and novels is a Bengali Muslim called Qazi Nazrul Islam, and he has written such beautiful poetry to the divine mother, And it just blows your mind that this is always been there in certain cultures, but when it reaches a different culture, it's considered a fad sometimes, and there's also a lot of exoticization. So it seems like when certain people do it, and in certain time frames and in certain spaces, it's looked down upon. But then when it moves into different spaces, then it's more pronounced and it's considered more important. I think this is really something that we should consider.
Thank you, Pravina. I'm reminded of a colleague of mine, and this is anecdotal, but what do we have if not stories? Uh, um, who their family self-identifies as Hindu, and their family's from Lucknow. And I think some of this is documented in the book Daughter of Fire. 2 generations back, their guru was actually a Sufi sheikh who decided that they were just going to move the tradition from an Islamically based tradition to a more Hindu-based tradition. And of course, Hindu is a problematic term, but we'll use it for this time. And there's no like rancor or dissonance there. It's just like, nope, we're Hindu now. And then the tradition that, the next generations inherited that tradition. And there's the types of boxes that we want to put around these traditions, we meaning societally or human beings or whosoever, don't really exist. They're much more. They can be much more fluid and porous. And something that you brought up may also leads to a separate question, but I do want to just put a plug for everyone in attendance that if you'd like to ask a question, we'll move to the Q&A very soon. So be sure to get your questions in by using the Q&A feature. Otherwise, I can certainly ask questions all night. So you probably should better do that rather than listening to my questions. Although this one I think is a good one. In terms of cultural appropriation and spiritual materialism, that certainly in the West, and I'm using that term very broadly to mean North America, Western Europe, there is an aspect of spiritual materialism or consumerism that says, I can, just by virtue of me being here, living here, having access to, I should be able to take whatever I want from any tradition and practice howsoever I want and share that with whosoever I want. And obviously there are dynamics of power that are associated with that. And one of my recent pieces that I've recently submitted looks at the importation and reconfiguration of Zen or Chan in martial arts practice to signify these imagined histories of these samurai warriors that practice Zen and did a specific type of religious practice that never actually existed as a construct of 19th and 20th century East Asian and Western interpolations. That has its own particular effects in the way that people now practice spiritual traditions, the way that they may consume pieces of them that might be harmful to those who are practicing them in toto, or even just presuming that a tradition is open, meaning that anyone can practice the practices in a tradition, or anyone is welcome to become an adherent of that tradition or a practitioner of that tradition, whereas some traditions are closed. You have to be born into it, or you have to be given specific authority to do something. So perhaps, Pravina, because the thread that you're speaking of, I think, does lean towards requiring us to think about cultural appropriation. What thoughts might you have about that?
Thank you. So, in the second chapter of my forthcoming publication, I actually speak about cultural appropriation, and I cite scholars Young and Brunk, and they basically talk about various aspects of cultural appropriation. But religious appropriation is considered almost like sexualized violence, and the title of that chapter is the skin of our backs, because it is actually considered as stealing the skin of indigenous cultures or natives' backs, right? And thank God for this research, which I used, while studying this topic of appropriation. In India, actually, no one really talks about appropriation because the way the culture is different, right? But in America, it's important, and that's the reason why I included it here. But in the context of appropriation, there are three factors that these scholars mention. So the U.S. Constitution upholds the freedom of belief, which means that you have the right to basically use anything for your own good, for your spirituality, for your gain, or for various other aspects. But it's not an absolute right. It's like I have the freedom of speech, but I can't go into a movie theater and scream fire. So it's not an absolute right. And within the context of appropriation, there are several factors that have to be considered. So first is the morality of the act. Is it moral? The availability of free and equal access, basically to discredit distortive, misinterpretive ideas. Because what happens is when there are people who are just taking something out of its context and using it, there is a tendency to come up with a mutation and a distortion, and what happens is it's basically harmful for indigenous communities. And then the third point that they mentioned is that the one who's basically taking something from the other needs to consider their rights and also their responsibilities towards the other. Because you see, what happens is, as you mentioned, power is, there are some communities that have power, and then there are certain communities that don't. So when you're taking something from indigenous communities, it kind of threatens their cultural identity, because you may be presenting it or representing it in a particular way, and then when they would like to present it, and if they somehow disagree with that presentation, they don't have the power to sort of contradict or to basically assert what it is. So it becomes like this kind of a situation in which the dominant party, the one who's basically taking, has more power, and then comes up with different forms of that culture, which may basically be harmful to indigenous communities or whoever they're taking it from.
Very important point, Pravina. Thank you. Scott, do you have something to add here?
I'm really glad you didn't ask me first, because I think what Pravina just said summed it all up really wonderfully well. I just want to reiterate that question of power. That's really, for me, the question of appropriation. I think that becomes one of the most important things. It's not just the so within circles of American and certain circles of American Buddhism, this question comes up all the time, particularly amongst otherwise well-intentioned white folks who have some combination of white savior complex or just suddenly discovered intersectionality. They get really nervous about I'm trying to practice Zen, am I appropriating it, should I not be here, those kinds of things. And so this question comes up in a very angst-ridden kind of way. And I think that this question of power, I think, is really the primary issue there. What sort of power is one exerting over the tradition or over a community or over people? That needs to be brought into those conversations. And to go back to what I said before, I think, again, community really matters. It's one thing to say, I'm going to go down to Pier 1 and buy a decapitated Buddha head to stick in my garden. It's another thing to deeply immerse yourself within a community and actually become responsible to, that was the other word that came up, responsible to that community. Those are two very different practices in my view.
And I would also add that it's very important. I mean, that's why I was mentioning, for me, this work is descriptive, partly because I don't want to start with the valency or the notion that hybridity is a positive is positive or negative in many ways. Um, One of the pieces that I've been writing about in the politics of religious hybridity is the hybridity of Christianity and QAnon, or the hybridity of multiple religious traditions and predatory capitalism. In fact, that's not exclusive to only one tradition. We're seeing it happen all over the world. Um, and so I point those out because those hybridities, again, this primary element is seen as religious, and while another element is ideological, it finds its way into stories and into, particularly in the United States in the last 4 years, uh, and I would add to that racial supremacy, which has always been a hybrid notion in multiple religious traditions, whether it's racial or other forms of supremacy of one group or one community or one um, particular part of society. So thinking here in the US context. So I think it's important to keep that in mind so that we understand that after a time when that ideology finds its home and its place, particularly in congregations that we've seen in the last 4 years, that these forms, some of these forms of what might have been seen initially as conspiracy theories, the surprise that people have when there is an incredible adherence to a cohesive belief system that integrates what are seen as conspiracy theories into the ritual of congregations, into the worldview. And I think that we, as scholars of religion, frankly, have underestimated this connection between that hybrid identity of an ideology that becomes connected to a group identity. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's important to study hybridities with a sense of what is happening, what are people doing, and to understand that, as particularly for in this case, I'm studying it as an outsider, is to understand that when there is a vehement kind of connection, the separation between the religious belief system and that particular ideology can sometimes get to a point where the individual, and then if furthered by the state, in fact, which it was in those 4 years, and furthered by religious leaders and public ritual and performance. There's a whole ritual that came into this space. And that's why I wanted to add the last thing to this is the growth of religious practice and radicalization around supremacy of racial categories. Religion is also forming and happening and developing online. And I think that's another piece of this hybridity that is really important from my study in terms of where and how are people forming identity, and where and how are they looking for a sense of belonging. And when there isn't a sense of belonging, this hybridity allows for the capacity of those forms of what might have been marginalized conspiracy theories at one time to become mainstreamed and funded, by the way, as well. These are funded sorts of processes that integrate themselves into the interpretation that many have of their self-understanding of their own religious identity. So that was something that's not new. It's just the capacity for it to happen very quickly and efficiently through online mechanisms. And this impacts multiple religious traditions, not just Christianity.
Thank you, Najib. I appreciate you lifting that up. So one final question before we take one from the audience. Perhaps we can start with you on this one, Scott. The topic of interreligious or intra-religious dialogue, whether we call it multi-religiosity or spiritual hybridity, or howsoever we conceive of this topic of multi-religiosity, how might you see it interfacing with interreligious or intra-religious dialogue?
I'm sorry, Sam, can you repeat that? I got a little connection problem.
Oh, no problem. Looking at interreligious or intra-religious dialogue. And if we were thinking about multi-religiosity or multiple religious belonging, spiritual fluidity or hybridity, how would you see it perhaps interfacing with interreligious or intra-religious dialogue?
The concepts of dialogue and identity or belonging?
And multi-religious belonging. So, perhaps oftentimes we think of, we meaning the academy usually thinks of interreligious dialogue as happening between these two traditions, like Islam is going to do dialogue with Christianity and then, see what happens out of that. But looking at it from multi-religiosity or having multiple religious belonging or spiritually fluid communities puts quite a different spin on the concept of interreligious or even intra-religious dialogue. I'm recalling an article by Satsuki Murata and William Chittick on the implicit dialogue of Confucian Muslims. Any thoughts you might have?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that question. I really feel like I need to probably sit with that one a bit more. And I say this in part because of an experience that I had with interreligious dialogue that I would say is an experience of how not to do it. Early in my grad school career, I took a course on interreligious dialogue, and most of the students in the class were Christian, of a variety of types. There was one woman who was a self-identified practicing Wiccan, and then there was myself, who was still trying to figure out at the time who I was and my identity, but got pegged as the Buddhist in the room. And so oftentimes conversations would revolve around the dominant Christian voice in the room saying, well, what's the Buddhist perspective on this issue? Which was endlessly frustrating, because being asked to be the spokesperson for an entire group is frustrating in and of itself. But then a month or two into the semester, when it was too late for any of us to drop the class, the professor, who had his own particular perspective and experiences, he grew up in a Christian missionary family in northeastern India, and so had a lot of experiences, as Pravina was talking about, in a sort of multi-religious context. And he was very, very passionate about understanding the lived realities of interreligious dialogue and cared very deeply about these things. But at some point in the semester, he sort of hijacked the class and forced us all to debate the question of the personhood of God. And he really wanted us all to come to an agreement on this theological question, which I had no opinion on whatsoever. And I say this as an example of what not to do, because in reflection on this over the many years since then, I realized that he was imposing a particular ideological or theological perspective that shaped the terms of the debate. Right? He came into the debate with, this is how we're going to have this conversation. I'm happy to have an interreligious conversation with you, but we're going to have it on these terms, which precludes the possibility of actual conversation, quite frankly. So I say this in response to your question, Sam, because it seems to me that whether you're talking about persons who have a single religious identity or a multiple religious identity, you still have to find a way to have openness and not try to use that conversation as a way to press a particular agenda or a particular theological perspective or ideology. If you don't want to irritate the one Buddhist in the room anyway, or alienate people in general.
It's a great cautionary tale, Scott. A very valuable learning experience for all of us, I think. Thank you for sharing that. Pravina, this is likewise your field. I feel like you might have some interesting thoughts on this.
So and of course there are many definitions by scholars. So interreligious dialogue per se, as you mentioned, is grassroots movements where you'll have communities or sometimes between people, and it's not, sometimes it's not even, you know, agenda driven, or it doesn't have like social issues attached to it. Sometimes it may have community related issues, social justice activism, so on and so forth. But sometimes it can just be meeting of people and sharing narratives from their tradition and just learning from one another without imposing, as Dr. Mitchell mentioned, without imposing someone's theology on another. That's interreligious dialogue. That's how it's supposed to be. However, what happens is that it's rooted in a particular tradition, and it comes from a Christian context. So it has a specific way of looking, and I think that is what other traditions have to be careful about. And of course there's always problems related to how do we agree on things, or what's the point of this. Is it supposed to be religious? If it's not religious, then we should call it something else. We should label it as something else. But it seems like in many communities, at least in South Asia, what happens is, because of organic presence of multi-religiosity and multi-linguistic and multi-everything, let me tell you, it's extremely complex and so plural that I can travel just 3 hours away from Mumbai down south and up north, and there will be a community who does not understand my language and who sees me as an outsider. So that's the kind of complexity we're talking about. But it seems like what happens is that interreligiosity, as it exists in South Asia, has creates like this, because of the way it's lived, because of the presence of various religions and constant flow, back and forth flows. There is an epistemic hospitality and a worldview that is like this cognitive shift, which accepts. And I don't want to use the word tolerance, because I think there's like this acceptance that when I'm talking about my religion, it doesn't have to exclude your worldview. It doesn't have to exclude your perspective. It can be my specific subjective point of view, but it doesn't have to it doesn't have to prove that you are false. So and that grounding particularly seems to be a very Hindu non-exclusive kind of porous way of being, where you can be this or you can be that or you can be whatever you choose to do. And it's not relativism, but it's just your point of view, and what you see is limited. But it's definitely positive. So that's interreligiosity, at in a very organic way. And then what happens is that basically stirs intra-religious dialogue, because that helps people think internally about everything that's going on. When you're going for an Eid festival and you're sitting with another community who believes and expresses their religiosity in a different way, how does that engagement create a cognitive shift and change your worldview? So my definition of multi-religiosity and how it basically interfaces is more of a paradigm shift. It's more of a of a broadening of the mind and openness, which allows the other to be, and looks at the other and differences as nourishing and complementary, not contradictory.
So I would, I think on this, draw also from, again, theories of fragile states. I'm preparing a course on peacemaking in times of fragile democracies. And the reason I think that theory is important is that we used to think in interreligious dialogue, or coming from sort of human contact theory, which is that if people have meaningful contact, they will deprovincialize and open up understandings of those that are different. What we found in the study of fragile states and what we've seen in this past 20 years of violence around the world is that it's not difference that breeds conflict and bloodshed, but in fact, it's when communities share some resources, some common history, a river, I'm just pointing out whatever it may be, resources, so that violence in many parts of the world are not from communities that are wildly different ideologically or culturally different or linguistically different. In fact, we're seeing the collapse of states where communities share some forms of identity. So I would point that out with religious misunderstanding and violence also, that it hasn't necessarily been communities that have, they're not showing up at the table with very radically different theological, doctrinal, or scriptural difference. In fact, in many places in the world, some of the worst violence has been between communities of the same religious background, but maybe a different, whether it's sectarian violence or it could be ethnic violence related to identities of different form, but of the same religious tradition. So I wanted to point that out because I think one of the problems we face in interreligious dialogue is the assumption that difference creates conflict and that sameness creates understanding. And I think we have to interrogate that. And also that the assumption that liberal and porous theologies are create opportunities where people will be more open to religious pluralism, and bounded and conservative, quote unquote, I use that word conservative in from a particular perspective, somehow will not allow for interreligious engagement. And in fact, I don't think that's always true. Some of the more difficult interreligious dialogues I've done are with community groups that say we're very open, but then they're open religiously, but then they don't really want to hear from someone who's from my embodiment. So I'm just pointing out that racism and xenophobia and all of those are still functional. So we can't assume that just because of a theological perspective that is more quote unquote open, that it's going to allow for a conversation that is more hospitable. So I think it's really always important to kind of interrogate the assumptions that we bring to the work and to see what's actually happening. And particularly this idea that people who share something do not need or don't need to engage in dialogue. I know our time is almost up, so I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Najiba. And I completely agree with everything that you've said, and I appreciate each of your comments, Pravina and Scott, as well. We are coming close to time, and I hope we can go just a few minutes over to address a comment and a question that I think will be illuminating to all of us, or has the chance to be. One is from Lilia. The comment is that they want to thank Scott for validating what they have been saying about the watering down of Buddhism as a religion when scholars and others say it's just a philosophy. So that resonated with Lilia. And also Lilia wanted to say that in their experience, some congregations that don't care about the cultural or religiosity of minorities or other groups use the fear of committing cultural appropriation as an excuse for denying them the expression of their particular rituals, and poetry, etc. So thank you very much, Lilia, for being willing to share your experience and adding to the discussion. And a question also from Jesse, curious about whether or how the concept of reciprocity as an element of spiritual or religious practice might or might not resonate for each of us. Reciprocity is a really interesting one, especially in thinking about hospitality and interreligious dialogue. Does that spring to mind for any of us? The concept of reciprocity, of having resonance with either the spiritual practices that we might engage in or the ones that we might study?
So part of Hindu doctrine, one of the sayings actually is Atiti Devo Bhava, which means Atiti means someone who comes on a time where they're not supposed to be there. It's not scheduled. So Atiti means And Devo Bhava means someone who comes, who's not scheduled to arrive and comes at that time is basically like God, Devo Bhava, right? So there is this notion of hospitality and being open and recognizing the presence of divinity, being receptive to the other, and it doesn't matter at what time. So in South Asian culture, specifically in India, when a guest comes, you don't ask them when you're going to leave. You kind of guess, depending on how many bags they have, and you kind of look around a little bit, and then you ask some smart questions, but you don't really ask them to leave. So hospitality is a big deal. And hospitality, of course, was also abused. That's what Dr. Swamini Swatma Vidyananda, who is a visiting faculty at the Center for Dharma Study, says that it was abused by the colonizers because they came as guests and then they colonized the country. So hospitality is something that is a part of Hindu culture, and is recognized. And of course, we have enough research to prove now that most of the conflict, the religious conflict that takes place, is not really, sometimes it doesn't even really have to do with religion. It has to do with economics, it has to do with politics. And when we're talking about certain countries in the world, like for example South Asia, where the poverty is so high, you can literally buy someone, or you can pay someone to create conflict. So that's just something I wanted to say. Thank you.
Because my work has largely been, again, looking at religious hybridity and the call to activism. One of the really profound pieces that we have been able to utilize this idea of hospitality is around the sanctuary movement and the new sanctuary movement in California, and the assistance for immigrants that was granted by multiple religious communities during the last administration. So I think it's really powerful that an interreligious approach to hospitality galvanized Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Sikh, multiple communities, some to house individuals that were trying to deal with deportation, and others to do services and rituals. We did many rituals in front of detention centers throughout the last administration, to honor and connect and have conversations around around the need for giving safe harbor. And all of these religious traditions, the stories that were shared were taking in the stranger. The idea of sanctuary cities is not new. It finds its history in multiple religious traditions. So I don't know if that's where the question meant to go around hospitality, but I was extending sort of these concepts that are wonderful in a very low stakes kind of engagement can also be extrapolated into when communities are threatened, and we can see how there become political elements and engagements around activism, and that it is the spiritual understanding of these communities that led them to do this work. It wasn't an extraneous motivation. It was deeply textual and deeply scriptural for many of these communities.
I'll just jump in and add and lift up the Buddhist concept of dana, or selfless giving, which is an important part across the Buddhist tradition. In the Mahayana tradition, it becomes one of the paramitas, or perfections. It's one of the practices that bodhisattvas do. And I'm reminded of the work of two scholars, Paulina Kolata and Gwendolyn Gilson, who've done work on the practices of Buddhist women in Japan, and the importance of hospitality and food, and the way in which this work is both understood as as a Buddhist practice in and of itself, of dana or of hospitality or of generosity, and is oftentimes very much linked to a specific bodhisattva practice. And if you're not attentive to the religious work that happens outside of the temple or outside of the expected places, you tend to overlook it or dismiss it as domestic labor or cultural practices, or however you want to say it. But it's deeply rooted to this idea of selfless giving, which I think is what came to mind to me with the term of reciprocity in the conversation we've been having.
Thank you very much, Scott. And I would add from my own perspective, Jesse, so the two things that come up for me, one is in the Islamic tradition, the other in Buddhist traditions. The Islamic tradition, the idea of reciprocity as equanimity within this concept called tawheed, or oneness, which usually has three frames: oneness of God, oneness of the message, and oneness of humanity, that all human beings are equal. There's no hierarchy, and because of that, there's no intercession between oneself and God, and that sets the stage for all different types of interreligious dialogue and reciprocity and hospitality. And then more specific to the idea of reciprocity in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, there's the idea of Tonglen, or it's a meditative practice of giving and taking, that one takes on the suffering of all beings and then gives back all goodness. There are many different expressions of this practice, and one of them is really the destruction of the ego, that one is able to see oneself as not only equal to but in service of all other beings, and that type of reciprocity is pretty deep. So not meaning to flatten both traditions and say that reciprocity is the same, but those are definitely two inspirations that come to me. Very good. Any closing thoughts, parting words from our group? Great. Well, let me, on behalf of everyone that has attended and everyone at the Center for Multi-Religious Studies and at Sarah King School for Ministry, just appreciate you and thank you so much for spending your time with us, and you're sharing your knowledge, and really being wonderful participants and excellent first guests at our inaugural panel series. So unfortunately, we can't really applaud for you. So I'll just raise my hands and hope that everyone behind their screens is doing the same. And I see a lot of chats in the chat box saying thank you. So thank you very much, each one of you. Thank you, Ellen and Xander and Allison, and everyone that has contributed to putting this event together. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Please do join us next time.